Good afternoon, everyone. Dear ambassadors, dear partners and colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it's a huge pleasure to welcome you to the launch of IDMC's 2019 Global Report on Internal Displacement. It's also a real honor for me to be joined today by some very, very special guests who've come a long way to be with us today to discuss some of the report's findings, and particularly its urban focus. I will be introducing them all to you in a few minutes, but before I do, I'd like to say a few words about why we're here today. Every year, the launch of our global report is our opportunity to remind the world that much of the attention, much of the debates, much of the analysis and the rhetoric have been focused on the hundreds of thousands of vulnerable migrants and refugees trying to make their way to Europe and to the United States. But there's a huge group of people and a large part of the global displacement picture that is consistently being overlooked. Millions of stories that are not being told, millions of lives that unfold far away from the television screens. And now you can hear them. Millions of people who are invisible to much of the international community. So I would like to start by telling you one of these stories. It's the story of an 11-year-old girl from Pakistan. She lived with her brother and her parents in a small village in the Swat Valley. Just like every other child of her age, she was full of life. She loved her home, she loved her friends, she loved her school. And more than anything else, she loved reading and she loved books. One day, her parents woke her up in the middle of the night and they told her to pack a small bag because they were leaving. They were leaving to escape the violence that was increasingly being committed by the Taliban in the surrounding villages. That night, in a matter of minutes, she had to decide what to put in that bag. And because they were too heavy and because there were too many of them, she had to leave all her books behind. Before leaving the country and eventually becoming refugees, she and her family were first internally displaced. And during that time, they moved across the country. They moved from one city to another, from one relative's place to another. And it was at the age of 11 that this young girl discovered, and I quote, that to be displaced on top of everything else is to worry about being a burden on others. This is the story of Malala Yousafzai, who you all no doubt know. She won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2014 for her struggle for all young girls to access education. She published a book recently called We Are Displaced, and in that book she says something very important that I'd like to share with you today. She says, "It never fails to shock me how people take peace for granted. I am grateful for it every day. Not everyone has it. Millions of men, women, and children experience wars every day. Their reality is violence, homes destroyed, innocent lives lost. And the only choice they have for safety is to leave, to choose to be displaced. That is not much of a choice." Ladies and gentlemen, there are millions of stories like the ones in Malala's book. Last year, we saw 28 million new instances of people being driven from their homes by conflict and by disaster. We have now hit the sad record of 41.3 million people living internally displaced as a result of conflict and violence across the world. Ethiopia continued as Africa's fastest growing displacement crisis. Countless families had to move into overcrowded centers and into displacement camps to escape ethnic and intercommunal violence in West Guji, Gedeo, and Benishangul Gumuz. Among these families, there was Nasteo here. Nasteo is here with her children. She's an ethnic Somali who had to flee violence in the Oromia region of Ethiopia. Back home, she used to own a restaurant business with her husband. But they had to flee with their children to the Koloji displacement camp near the city of Jijiga, where they've been living for this past year. They have left everything behind. And Nasteo's family today struggles to survive on the little food aid that they receive. Last year, new conflicts and violence flared up in several countries in West Africa. Young girls and boys watched their schools burn down in Cameroon. And hundreds of thousands were displaced across the Lake Chad region, but also in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. While conflict in Syria and Iraq continued to cause widespread displacement in 2018, the political situation in Libya deteriorated so dramatically that it caused new displacement, particularly in the country's urban centers. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, among the thousands who were forced out of their homes by armed violence in the Kasai province, there was Elamegi. One of Elamegi's children was killed by local militia. She gave birth in the forest, where she stayed for 4 months, hiding away from the violence. Even though Elamegi and her children have been able to return to their village of origin, she says life there, for her and for her children, will never be the same again. Homes, markets, schools, health centers have all been destroyed. In the Philippines, China, and India, some of the worst monsoon floods and tropical cyclones forced close to 10 million people out of their homes. In the United States, almost 500,000 Californians watched their homes burn down in wildfires. 22,000 people there are still displaced today. Several countries that were already dealing with the effects of decades of armed conflict were also hit by disasters during the year. In Syria and Iraq, IDPs who'd been displaced by conflict and were living in camps got flooded and had to be relocated and displaced again. In Somalia and Nigeria, extended rainy seasons forced millions of people out of their homes. And in Afghanistan, drought last year displaced as many people as conflict did. This is Guljan. She left her village in the Abkamari district of Afghanistan, and she went in search of food and drinking water during what she describes as the worst drought in her lifetime. She's been living in this makeshift home in an IDP settlement for the last 4 months. She's there with her son and her grandchildren. The children have been forced out of school because of the drought. And her son says that on top of this drought, he has been displaced repeatedly by conflict over the last 30 years. What our global map shows is that from Central America to the Middle East, from Africa to the Pacific, rich and poor, male and female, old and young, are experiencing internal displacement. Now, there are 4 issues that I would like to draw out of our report and to highlight specifically today. The first one is that very few people in the world experience displacement as a one-off episode. Repeated displacement is the reality for many. From DRC to South Sudan, from Syria to Yemen, families often have no other choice but to continue moving until they reach safety. Across South and Southeast Asia, the same communities suffer the impacts of multiple hazards during the same year. And in many countries, the lack of tenure security, particularly in cities and informal settlements, increases the risk of being evicted and displaced again. Just like for Nasteo, Elamegi, and Guljang, every new wave of displacement is like a shock to the system. It chips away at people's resilience and it weakens them for the next blow. Second, displacement affects people in richer and poorer countries in different ways. Much of the disaster displacement that we report every year relates to government evacuations in relatively well-prepared and disaster-aware countries like Japan, Indonesia, and the US. In those countries, displacement is actually an effective life-saving measure in the face of disasters. But nevertheless, it still shows that too many people there remain exposed to extreme weather events. It's often in sub-Saharan Africa and in other lower income countries in Asia or the Caribbean that disaster impacts are the most severe. Mortality rates are higher, the damage to infrastructure is more acute, and displacement there tends to last much longer. Just last week, what happened in the state of Odisha in India was hailed as an early warning success story. The government preemptively evacuated over 1 million people ahead of Cyclone Fani and prevented the massive loss of life. We mustn't overlook the fact, however, that given the poverty levels there, there's a high risk that the displacement that this has created will end up becoming protracted, just like it has done for the tens of thousands of people who are still displaced today following the Nepal and the Haiti earthquakes from several years ago. And we can already see that in Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and Malawi, it's obvious that the people and the communities who've been displaced by Cyclone Idai will take years, if not decades, to recover. Third, whether in a rich or a poor country, it is always the most vulnerable who are the worst affected. In California, those who are still displaced today are the lower income households who could not afford housing insurance and for whom it will be much harder to rebuild their homes and to recover from the losses. Women and children continue to be a particularly vulnerable group. In Nigeria, we found that it was much harder for displaced women to access employment in cities like Maiduguri. Across the world, women who lose their husbands to conflict or to disaster are left alone to care for themselves and for their children. And in the worst case scenarios, they end up entirely alone. This is Rashida, whom I had the pleasure of meeting on Kutubdia Island in Bangladesh in February. She was displaced 30 years ago by a devastating cyclone during which she lost her husband, her son, and her home. She depends entirely on her community for survival. She told me that she lives in constant fear that another disaster will hit, because she knows that if it does, neither she nor her house may sustain its impacts. In Yemen, Ahlam here lost her husband to shelling. She now lives in a camp, and she has to sacrifice herself every day and go hungry so that she can feed her children. The millions of stories like Rashida's and like Ahlam's show us that displacement is likely to have impacts that will continue into the next generations. It will affect women's resilience, their mental health, and their employment prospects, which in turn will affect their children's education and their well-being. We must not underestimate what this will mean, not just for people, but for countries themselves, as they're robbed of this crucial human capital. The fourth issue is the difficult problem of ensuring sustainable returns and other durable solutions. For so many of the world's IDPs, the only thing that keeps them going is the hope that one day they'll be able to return to their home and to resume a normal life. Last year, this hope became a reality for large numbers of IDPs from Syria to Afghanistan, Ethiopia to Somalia. IDPs who made the difficult journeys back to their villages and their towns of origin. These returns were considered by many observers as a positive sign that the situation on the ground in these countries was improving. The reality, however, was far more complex. In the majority of cases, we couldn't be sure that these people were returning to adequate levels of safety and security, to a still standing home, and to services that would allow them to resume their lives. In the absence of data on their situation, we can't help now but fear that many of them today are at risk of becoming displaced again sometime in the near future. Some IDPs in the world can't even consider the possibility of return because of where they're from and what their family history has been. Bas Khalaf is one of hundreds of thousands of Yazidis who live in displacement camps in Iraq's northern Kurdistan region. She's been displaced with her family for 4 years. ISIS killed one of her sons. For her, it's very hard to consider going back to her village. She says the situation there is simply not safe enough for her. I traveled to Iraq last month, where I witnessed firsthand the challenges of reconstruction and of return. These challenges are enormous and they're incredibly complex. The return areas have to be demined. They have to be cleared so that they can become habitable again. And houses, roads, schools, and hospitals need to be rebuilt. This is going to take massive investment, and it's going to take time. But harder still, and yet most important of all, is the challenge of creating an environment in which families who've been torn apart by conflict and who've been associated to different parties of that conflict can begin to live alongside one another again. I had the pleasure of being in Azerbaijan last week, and there I saw just how much it takes to rebuild people's homes and to give them access to essential services. A good quality school, a functional health center with qualified doctors, a community center, a post office. In Jojug Marjanli, it's not just the village infrastructure that's been rebuilt, it's an entire community and everything that goes with it. A sense of shared space, of belonging, of safety. And that takes much longer to build and is much more challenging to sustain into the future. On all my recent travels these past months, I have witnessed how internal displacement is increasingly becoming an urban phenomenon. I've seen how in cities these 4 challenges that I've just highlighted play out in very specific ways. On the one hand, Towns and cities across the world are places where people who are fleeing conflict and disaster come to find refuge. On the other hand, they are places where various risks accumulate and where new displacement is generated as a result. Last year, conflict in cities triggered large waves of displacement from Hodeidah in Yemen to Tripoli in Libya to Dara in Syria. In fact, the majority of all new displacement recorded in the MENA region in 2018 occurred in urban contexts. Repeated displacement is a common feature from Kabul to Mogadishu. IDPs who don't own their own homes face a constant threat of eviction and of onward displacement. Forced evictions in Somalia accounted for 44% of all new displacement, and they were caused by a lack of adequate housing in increasingly crowded urban areas. The disproportionate impact of displacement on poor populations is also acutely felt in cities. In Asia, some of the most populated and densely populated cities in the world host huge numbers of people who are living in informal settlements which lack infrastructure and services. Now, this means that they're very vulnerable to displacement risk. IDMC's disaster displacement risk model shows that over 90% of the people at risk of flooding in Asia live in urban and in peri-urban areas. In Africa, 6 out of the 10 largest floods that triggered displacement in 2018 happened in cities, from Beledweyne in Somalia to Abuja in Nigeria. Urban displacement risk is also unevenly distributed between individuals. When I visited the slums in Dhaka in February, I met with people, including young single mothers, who were living in very precarious conditions, vulnerable to hazards like flooding, but also fire and electrocution. Sharif here moved to Dhaka 25 years ago and joined thousands of others like him into what is now known as Bola slum, one of Dhaka's many informal settlements. He has essentially gone from a life as an island dweller living off the land to working as a rickshaw puller in one of the busiest cities in the world, earning $30 a month. So having already been displaced once, he and his family are now exposed and they're vulnerable to new threats that could lead them to becoming displaced again. Finally, we also see how critical cities are for IDP's search for durable solutions and for returns in particular. In Mosul in Iraq and Marawi in the Philippines, even though active conflict there has ended, the widespread damage and destruction to the city continue to prevent people from returning home. The infrastructural damage to a city doesn't just complicate the physical rebuilding of homes and services, it also profoundly touches on people's sense of identity, on their cultural heritage, and it makes their return and the definitive end to their displacement even more challenging. Now, ladies and gentlemen, yes, displacement puts increasing demands on local governments for housing, for jobs, for quality healthcare, for education, for social protection. But at the same time, there are opportunities for cities to build on the potential that a new influx of people and of resources and of skills can bring. Arriving in a city offers many possibilities, and often these possibilities are found in the informal sector. In Latin American cities, more housing per square kilometer is built by informal settlers than it is by governments and developers. Regulators and municipalities can build on these investments and they can create bridges to formality and lasting solutions, especially for housing and employment. In the Ukraine, A rent-to-own initiative by the municipality of Mariupol has enabled IDPs to access affordable housing and to incrementally move towards home ownership. In Maiduguri in Nigeria, the city government has set up entrepreneurship centers for young people in the informal economy, specifically targeting IDPs. I'd like to end on a more positive story. It's the story of Jeremias here, who settled with his family in the city of Cali in Colombia a few years ago, after having been displaced in 2004 during the country's armed conflict. He's been able to set up a small business making arepas. His business is actually doing well now. He has thousands of clients, he employs 2 people, and he's been able to buy his own home in the city as a result. In his case, the city has provided him with a market, and it's provided him with new opportunities to become self-reliant and to take care of his family. Many examples of this kind exist. They show that cities can offer a conducive environment for local integration, and they show that local authorities have a key role to play in helping those IDPs who choose to settle and to seek refuge in a city actually find a durable solution. Balancing the challenges and the opportunities that displacement in urban areas present is what I would now like to turn to our panel to discuss. Thank you. I'd like to invite you to come up here. We have a bit of an odd UN setup with a big table in front of us, but we're going to make it work. I'm absolutely delighted to introduce you to our esteemed panelists today. On your left, closest to me, is Ms. Maimouna Maud Sharif. Ms. Sharif is the United Nations Under-Secretary General and Executive Director of UN Habitat, the United Nations Programme for Human Settlements and Urban Development. Welcome, Ms. Sharif. Next to her, we're also very happy to have with us today Mr. Kiyoshi Murakami. He's the Special Representative of the Office of the Mayor and Senior Executive Advisor of the city of Rikuzen Takata in Japan. The city of Rikuzen Takata was directly affected by the 2011 tsunami and nuclear disaster in Fukushima. Next to Mr. Murakami, I have the pleasure to introduce you all to Dr. Salimul Haq, the Director of the International Center for Climate Change and Development, ICAD, in Dhaka, Bangladesh. ICAD is a leader in research and capacity building on climate change and development in Bangladesh. Welcome to all of you, and thank you very much for being here with us today. As I said at the beginning, our esteemed panelists have traveled a long way to join us, so we're very excited to have you with us. What we're going to do is I'm going to ask you all a first question to frame the issue, and we're going to try and go from the global policy level all the way down to the local, very practical level, and we will have as much of a conversation as it's possible, and I would like to invite you all in the audience to ask questions if you have any throughout the discussion. I'd like to start with you, Ms. Sharif. As the lead agency of the United Nations on urban development, having heard what you've just heard and having seen the findings of our reports, I think the audience and I would be very interested in hearing what you think the current and the existing global policy processes and the existing frameworks, such as the new urban agenda, can do to better address the challenge of urban internal displacement.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much, Alexander, and a very good afternoon to Excellencies and colleagues. Thank you for having me here. Let me introduce myself. As introduced by Alexander just now, I'm the Under Secretary General and Executive Director of UN Habitat, which is also our mandate is to implement the new urban agenda, especially to achieve the SDG, especially the SDG 11. And by profession, I'm an urban planner, and I work in Penang, Malaysia. I'm from Malaysia. Before I came to Nairobi, and I took this post as Executive Director of UN Habitat, I was a mayor for 7 years. And when tsunami happened, I was in Penang. So I know, I have the experience, what Alexander was talking about internal displacement. So now when you talk about the new urban agenda, I think this new urban agenda has been endorsed by all the member states in Quito, Ecuador, in 2016. And now it's 2019. I think now is the time for implementation of this new urban agenda. Because without the roadmap by all cities or by all leaders to implement the new urban agenda in their countries or in their cities, it will remain an agenda. It's not no impact on the ground. Because the new urban agenda is pretty clear and offer great opportunities if we do it and implement it accordingly. Because this, the new urban agenda is committed to respect the human right, and also committed to respect human right not only on refugee, not only of migrant, and also including the internal displaced people, and irrespective of their status, of the where they come from, and this also include to call for support for access to job and livelihood. And number two is new urban agenda is committed to support with their host cities or the host countries. And then as ex-mayors, as I mentioned just now, I know very well that to set out and also to implement the new urban agenda, the movement of large population in town and cities is cause a lot of challenges to the cities. The pressure of the services, the pressure of the housing market, and also in terms of the very basic services for people to start their new life in the new place. I think mayors and local government in implementing the new urban agenda need support from the national government, need integrated and establishing the framework that enable the positive contribution of the cities to strengthen the function of the cities. And I think we need a collective responsibility to turn the new urban agenda into a practical tool, to a new localized action to tackle the problem that you see from all the photographs that is mentioned by Alexander just now. And to me, now is the time to act. It's now the time to bring all sectors together, because as a UN Habitat, we have our experience in dealing with this crisis in 2010, in the Port Prince Haiti in 2010, and also in Syrian cities. And we work also in Bangladesh, yeah, it's been Bangladesh. And as one of my, as I said, experience as a mayor, we have to look into the possibility of the cause of this internal displacement. To me, there are two. One is natural disaster, but sometimes this natural disaster is also man-made. Yeah, by deforestation, you cause a lot of flooding. By improper planning of cities also can cause chaos. What people used to say is natural disaster. But I think the natural disaster is not only natural, but it's also caused by men. And second is men. So how do we tackle this? And I have the experience myself when the Penang city was affected by the flooding. The whole city was flooded, and also a lot of people being displaced, and displaced into one area, and also the other part of the cities. And how we did it, I think we need to look into a solution, a more resilient and climate adaptation solution. I just came back from Mozambique. You tell me how much time do I have? Yeah, yeah. I just came back from Mozambique, and I was invited by the president to Mozambique after 1 month of the Cyclone Idai, because we UN Habitat, we are not the emergency agencies in the UN, because there are OCHA and other agencies, but we are more on the human settlement and rebuilding and reconstruction. And I was invited after 1 month, and I went to Beira, I went to Dando, and also I met the president, the ministers, and the mayors. And one thing that I realized that what we need very much at the local level is the integrated and holistic planning. I know that it's land, as you said, is very, very valuable. But I think the way I look at it, the cities just sprawl without a proper plan-led development. This will even increase the damages and also the work of the mayors. And there are mentioned to me saying that you see that Mozambique is around 60% of the land was very flat and below sea level, or flat-flown area. And I think we cannot, when we can mention that, oh, we want to displace the person, put into higher ground. But the higher ground was 50 or 60 kilometers. Then the place they are doing their business, the place their livelihood. So I think the way we have to look into that is in implementing the new urban agenda is looking into the climate adaptation, design, and rebuilding, building back better. Because one example that in Mozambique, that the work of the UN Habitat, and this one is mentioned not by me, by the Minister of Education. She told me, Maimuna, we would like you to scale up the resilient school in Mozambique. I said, why? Of all the building being damaged, except the school built by UN Habitat together with the World Bank, using the UN Habitat building code, which include resilient architecture, resilient building code, and using local material. And the mayor was so, is impressed. I said that is bad. Another area is that building one resilient building is not enough. We have to build resilient neighborhood. Because the way I look at it, that building is still stand, but the roof is collapsed. But I said, why the roof is collapsed? Because the surrounding areas, when the roof was flew, that is landed on the building. So this is the climate adaptation guideline and building block in the reconstruction that we are now working together with other UN agencies and with other donors to how we can help Mozambique to the extent that we can help in terms of the rebuilding and reconstruction, and to help the people to come back. But I really admire the Mozambican. When I went there, they are very resilient people. They already started trading along the road, they already start their own business. To me, that is, I think this is very, very encouraging to see the people have the resilient mentality. But of course, for the school and the children and all that, I think it's very, very sad to see this case happen. So I think we also have been working with the Joint IDP Profiling Service to develop urban profile in Syria, Lebanon, and elsewhere. And I, as leaders of the organization that dealing with the urbanization, I think we really now, I think Excellencies and friends, you have to convince your leaders who are making the decision back home to start thinking of having an integrated, holistic, sustainable development plan or plan-led development. Of course, it takes time, but I think now is the time to start thinking, because so that when the climate or the disasters comes again, it's not necessary for these people to be displaced from one place to another place if we are doing the planning. Because like for example in Mozambique, I was told the flat area last time during the Portuguese was not allowed to build any building within that stretch. But because of lack of planning, lack of regulation, lack of enforcement, people start reclaim and build the house. And yes, yet waiting to be wiped by the cyclone. Because the cyclone is almost every year. So that is one way that I would see that is, I would like to see how UN Habitat can work together, can collaborate and partners with your excellencies or the agencies to come out with resilient planning and resilient sustainable urbanization as a key factor to improve living condition for everybody. But if you want to see leaving no one and no space behind. Thank you. I will add on later on in the second part. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Sharif. I think it's important to start with that global perspective and to remind ourselves all that there are commitments under this new agenda. Maybe we'll come back also to the actual commitment that pertains specifically to the issue of urban crises, where displacement would I think logically fit, and what that's going to mean in the rollout of UN Habitat strategic plan for the next 5-7 years, actually until 2025. You started mentioning some of the concrete challenges involved in rebuilding after a disaster. You talked about build back better, making the cities more resilient to future disasters. So just now looking on the on the response side, what can a local government or a municipality do in the immediate aftermath of a devastating disaster? I'd like to turn to Mr. Murakami, who comes with a very concrete and practical and very emotional experience of the city of Rikuzen Takata in Japan. Do we have the...
Well, thank you very much, Madam Director Bilak. I'm going to talk about, this is my great honor and pleasure to be here and come back here, actually. I was working at the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees in almost 15 years ago. So this is a very, very nice to be back. And now I am going to discuss and also talk about the resilience for tomorrow, the case of the city of Rikuzen Takata. Now, so you're gonna talk. Okay, great. So my name is Kiyoshi Murakami. I'm a special representative of mayor and senior executive advisor to the city of Rikuzen Takata. Now, I'm going to talk about a little bit of what basically happens in 2011 tsunami in the Tohoku region or northeast Japan. And then also, it actually has a number of the photos actually a little bit of bothering you, I think. So please bear with me. If there's anything that you don't want to see it, that's okay. Okay, just go through that. Now, this is the city of Rikuzen Takata. I may have to look up this one. Maybe it's okay. All right. Okay. All right. Okay. So here's you can see that Tokyo, and then also it's the middle in center is the red point, and then also where the Iwate prefecture, and then the city actually here in the edge of the Iwate prefecture. It's probably about 500 kilometers north from Tokyo. Maybe over there. Yeah. Okay. So I think it is much better, yes, so that I can see at the same time as well. Good. Now, okay. This is the photo that actually my hometown used to be. Very beautiful city with the pine trees, forest, and the beaches, and a number of the tourists came to my city. And we actually had the time of the summer, particularly the tourists was as 3 times as much of the population. So that was very, very encouraging at the time. Now and then also this beach was actually very, very unique in this particular region. So it was very, very, how do you say, only one beach in that particular the region of Japan. So this is the before tsunami disaster. So you can see how the entire city, actually the entire city is covered by the forest. So not like the Mozambique, our city actually had only less than 20% of flat area. So most of the mountains. So that's there are a number of the limited area that you can build their own houses, basically. Now, many of you know that's what basically happens in 2011, the Tohoku or the Great East Japan earthquake and tsunami. And this is the earthquake actually happened 2:46 p.m. in afternoon of March 11, 2011. This is actually the 3:10, so 40 minutes basically after, the 20 minutes after the earthquake happens. So you can see whole buildings, most of the buildings is basically okay, no harmed. So basically most of the buildings here unharmed in a way. So that's it's a very, very strong buildings actually used. Now, tsunami actually reached around 3:25. You can see the bottom of the photos. Some people tried to get into the car. So they actually had 40 minutes of the time after the earthquake happens, and there was the number of the alert was made by the local government says that you have to escape and evacuate quickly. But people actually had reluctant to leave because they knew they actually had experienced a number of the tsunami before. So that actually had the tsunami's knowledge actually gave them to some kind of reluctancy to leave that home. But at this time, it was completely different. So that's what happened to those people. 1 minute later, within 4 minutes, whole cities was completely covered by tsunami itself. Within 10 minutes, whole cities was gone. Now, this is from the inside of the city. Actually, this was especially taken by one of the firefighters, who was on the top of the roof in the fire stations. As you see, those firefighters actually was on the roof of the building, but actually it was not enough, so that they have to go up to the take the tower of the fire stations. So they could survive. So after this, whole city was also completely gone like this. Now, this is the city hall. So this was the after the whole tsunami came, and then also first the tsunami the level was actually reduced within 20 minutes, and then you can see the number of people actually surviving on the roof of the buildings. So at this case, we lost 110 city officials among 400 people. Of course, all of them actually faced as they losing their houses and their families, and also the mayor himself. His name is the Futoshi Toba. He lost his wife, and while he was waiting on the top of the floor, the roof. And then also the casualty I'm going to talk about later on, but basically 1,800 lives were basically gone among the 24,000 populations. Now, as you could see, we had the pine tree forest in the beach. Only one pine tree was left, survived at that time. So we call this is the miracle pine because this is the only one pine tree left. You can see where the pine tree used to be. Actually, it was in a red dot here. So we didn't even notice that before the tsunami. This was special pine tree at that time, but. Now, this is the first night some people went into the school gymnasiums, school auditoriums, because the designated area for evacuation was also completely destroyed by the tsunami itself, so that they had to go to the number of the different schools that are actually available for the receiving peoples. Also, this is the one of the another auditoriums in the junior high school. This white and red flag. The thing is that actually in Japan, when we celebrate the inaugurations or celebration of any event, actually we use this, the curtain. And this time, this particular auditorium was just rebuilt, and the open ceremony was conducted in the morning time. And then afternoon, this tsunami happened, so that they actually kept the curtain as it was. Now, we actually received a number of supports from not only within Japan, but also from other countries. So the fact, this is data, the loss of life was almost 1,800 people among 24,000. Displaced people was 13,500 among 24,000. So much more than half of the whole population was completely displaced. And of course, the loss of houses, among 8,000, 4,000, which is half of the houses. But it doesn't mean the buildings. If you're talking about buildings, it's more than 10,000 buildings was basically gone. I'm going to just, this is the how many, how long it took to reduce that the people from refuged area, so that this is from the prefecture of Miyagi. That's the next door. Actually, I could taken, and within 3 months, people. Of course, the first week it was a huge number of people were displaced, so that they had to stay at the shelters, but they had to. But a number of the shelters that people left for after building the temporary housings, they actually move into temporary housing afterwards. So most friend of mine actually stayed in the shelter until August. So that means that he had to stay more than for 5 months. So that is the latest. So this is the temporary housing unit. Currently, we still use it. At the time of the 2011, 2,148 for the almost 500, 600 people. Then now we still have 275 units, even after the 8 years, for almost 700 people. Now, reconstruction, actually, we put together right after a disaster happens. And then the first 2 years, we actually spent the time of the planning and also consultation with the local people. Consultation took us quite a number of the timing they spent. And then also after that, the implementation stage. And the basic concept was build back better, resilient city, and inclusive and accessibility. We really wanted to have no one is left behind. So this was actually started from the early stage of the building of the whole city. So this is the landscape. So as you see, we had the tsunami the pine tree forest and the beach. Now we cannot use that whole area, so that we actually building as a memorial park. And then also on the yellow circled area and also red circled area, this is actually, we elevating whole area, so that we actually create a new landscape for that commercial. And then also the blue circled was actually for the new residential area. So that's we actually created new area like this. Actually took a lot of energies and a lot of investment as well. So Memorial Park is now almost opening up later this year. Also the commercial area, also shopping malls. Now, in order for us to create a new the landscape, this is we use as the conveyor belt. It's like one of the largest conveyor belts. Also, so the concept-wise, we actually come up with the new approach for using our disaster experience to new business development. So as I mentioned, that we actually put together the inclusion is the norm for our city. And there was a number of people and people with disabled people put together the action plan for our social development. Also, new businesses, creation of new industries, like we're going to have a pecan nuts from the United States to develop the new trees in our region together, collaborating with the US, as well as that we developing in international friendship, where our board from the high school actually wiped away, reached to one of the city called Crescent City of California in 2 years and a half later. And that's actually created a new relationship with California. So that's actually this is a new, not only people to people's
exchange, but also we actually have developments of the business together with the California state as well as the Crescent City. So, and then the SDGs, we really putting in our effort into that based on that our experiences and the new developments of the whole city. We're really putting into that the SDGs in our city. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kiyoshi. I gave you much more time because I really wanted everybody to see this presentation, as there are so many things that we could say about what you've just presented, so many lessons to be learnt from this experience, which was in many ways a very traumatic and a very emotional one, but where, as you've shown very clearly, some very positive things also came out of it. Before we start drawing out some of the lessons, I'd like to hand over to Salim here. We've looked at how one municipality responded to a devastating disaster and how long it took and how much it took to rebuild it. Salim is going to be walking us through now what it takes to actually anticipate and prepare for the future and for those disasters that haven't yet happened. So Salim, over to you.
Thank you very much, Alexandra, Madam Sharif, Mr. Murakami, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon and Assalamu alaikum. As you heard, my name is Salim Ul-Haq. I'm a researcher and a professor in a university. I run a research center called the International Center for Climate Change and Development, based at the Independent University in Bangladesh, in Dhaka, Bangladesh. And what I'm going to do is to give you a two-part story. First part being the story of my country, Bangladesh, the current situation there, and then the second part being looking into the future with what's going to happen with climate change and what we are doing to prepare, not just in Bangladesh, but hopefully help the rest of the world do the same. And this is in the context of potential numbers of internally displaced people. So let me start by describing the country. It's one of the poorest countries in the world. It has a population of 160 million people living in less than 150,000 square kilometers. So the population density is well over 1,000 people per square kilometer for the whole country. It's almost the definition of a city. It's located on the delta of three of the major rivers of the world, the Ganges, the Brahmaputra, and the Meghna, which regularly flood. And as I said, it's largely rural, agrarian, rice growing and other crop growing economy, and has still managed to develop and increase its economic growth rate for the last decade or so at the level of about 6 or 7%. And so it is emerging from being one of the poorest, least developed countries. It still belongs to the least developed countries group, but it's on the path to graduating out of the least developed countries group into the lower middle income countries group over the next few years. And so on particularly with regard to disaster-led impacts, it has actually got a lot of experience and has built on that experience, very similar to what Mr. Murakami showed in Japan, on cyclones in particular. So we are regularly hit by cyclones that originate in the Indian Ocean, come up the Bay of Bengal, and hit us. Just a few days ago, we had a very severe cyclone, which fortunately didn't hit us. It hit India, the state of Odisha, and fortunately didn't cause too much in terms of lives lost. They were able to evacuate well over 1 million people. Bangladesh also evacuated well over 1 million people. In fact, in Bangladesh, we tracked the cyclone. We knew what was happening. People were warned. People went to shelters. Fortunately, as I said, it didn't hit us in a big way, but we were prepared for it. And Bangladesh has I would argue, one of the best cyclone preparedness systems in the entire world. We can track, we can evacuate well over 1 million people very, very quickly. People know where to go, how to go, and are able to take preventive action, which has brought down the death rate from cyclones in Bangladesh to virtually zero now, from what used to be in the hundreds of thousands decades ago. We still have cyclones that cause a lot of damage, but they don't kill people anymore. We've been able to stop that. However, in the case of floods, it's more complex. A cyclone is a time-bound thing. You can track it coming. You take shelter for a few hours, it comes and it goes. Then you go back home. In the case of flooding, it's much more complex, and that's really where it is a much more difficult situation. And if you look at the report that's just been launched here, you'll see a case study of Dhaka City and flooding in Dhaka City. Dhaka City itself is the fastest growing megacity in the world, in the order of 16, 17 million people, and well over 90% of migrants, internal migrants coming from rural Bangladesh, end up in Dhaka City. We have well over 200 slums in the city, each slum associated with a part of the country from where people have been coming for many years. You saw the pictures of Rashid from the Bhola slum. Bhola is an island offshore Bangladesh, and many people have come to that slum from Bhola over many, many years. So this migration from rural to urban is an ongoing phenomena. It has a multiplicity of causes. Some are pull factors, people come for economic reasons. Some are push factors, they lose their land or their livelihoods and are forced to move. And it's in that context now that we have the additional problem, both Bangladesh and the rest of the world, of climate change, human-induced climate change, which is going to cause an increase in the severity of these cyclonic events and flooding events and even drought events, although we are not a particularly drought-prone country, which are going to lead to forced displacement of populations in the many, many tens of millions around the world. At the moment, it's a very difficult thing to attribute whether a migrant or a person being displaced is because of climate change, but in future, it's not difficult to predict. And in the case of Bangladesh, we are predicting, this is a prediction, not just a scenario, in the order of 10 million people over the next decade or two, mainly from the low-lying coastal part of the country, which is already being affected by salinity from sea level rise, are going to have to move. They will simply not be able to continue their livelihoods of farming and fishing there. However, the time scale of that allows us to take some anticipatory actions, and this is really what I and my center and my colleagues work on. It is anticipating that if we don't take early action, we don't prepare for this, then we are looking at a potential millions of people forcibly displaced from low-lying coastal parts of the country and ending up in Dhaka City. Dhaka City can't take another 10 million people. It's already bursting at the seams. So how do we avoid it? And that's really what we are working on. It's not, I won't even call it a full-fledged plan yet. It's more of an experiment, a piloting. What we are looking at is developing in the order of 20 secondary towns, which have now populations of around 500,000 to 1 million, and enabling these towns to become what we call climate resilient, migrant-friendly towns, so that they can attract, over a period of time, create the economic conditions and job opportunities for people to come. But in the longer term, we are actually talking about educating the children of the people living in the coastal areas. So at the moment, the efforts are to help them adapt to the impacts of climate change. As we heard in the case of Mozambique, they are very badly affected and exposed, so we have to help them where they are. A lot of it is providing safe drinking water because salinity has increased there and people are actually drinking saline water. If you and I were to go there and drink that water, it will taste salty to us. The human body can tolerate quite a lot of salt, except for pregnant women. They are particularly badly affected by getting hypertension that can lead to preeclampsia. So at the moment, it's about helping them adapt to the conditions where they are, but in the longer run, it's about educating and capacitating their children, their young girls and their young boys, so that they don't have to end up being farmers and fishers like their parents and can move to these towns. So we're preparing education opportunities for the girls and boys to move to these towns, to get educated, and then hopefully remain in those towns over a period of time, which addresses the second half of our program, which I mentioned, is about migrant friendliness. The climate resilience is about infrastructure, building the city roads, highways, buildings in a manner that are not affected by the impacts, as we saw in the case of Japan a few minutes ago. But the other half of the question is about people accepting other people coming from outside their town to their own town and becoming neighbors and citizens and accepting them. And this everywhere, all over the world, is a tension between host communities and migrant communities that we want to address. We want to enable the migrant coming in to become a full-fledged citizen and be accepted by the host population to be fellow citizens in that case. And one of the areas, as I mentioned, is through education. Children of migrants studying with children of host communities become friends. They see themselves over time as just fellow citizens. They don't see each other as different from each other. And that is a path to citizenship and a path to absorption and acceptance that we are aiming at developing further through educational establishments, from schools to colleges to universities in these different towns, at the same time as looking for economic opportunities to create the jobs that will attract other people, so that the 10 million people that I mentioned that are prospective, potential climate displaced people can plan their own movement, can move themselves, be enabled to do that, not told to do that, facilitated to do it, and that they end up in these towns, be better off economically in terms of adapting to climate change. They no longer have the problems anymore, and we avoid them ending up in Dhaka city and living in the slums of Dhaka city. So not sure if we'll succeed, but it's certainly an effort that we want to put all our intention in, and if anybody is interested in learning more and sharing knowledge, we'd love to share knowledge with other cities and towns, and we hope we can collaborate with you and Habitat and with the Japanese government as well. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Salimul. Very interesting work. Of course, we fully support you in that mission. We look forward to collaborating on that. Ms. Sharif, having heard the presentations, having listened to not just the global picture, but these two very concrete examples, and with your, if I may say, your double hat as the Executive Director of UN Habitat, but also as someone who's got a practical experience working as a mayor, are there any, I think I will recap the lessons that have already come out of here, but are there any other models that you can think of across the world that can serve as useful examples, not just on the response side, but also on the prevention side, that you'd like to share with us?
Thank you very much, Alexander. As you correctly mentioned, that I have the experience as a mayor before, for 7 years, and involved in tsunami, and also involved in the resettlement. I will share one example since you asked, and also example at the global level, and what we would like to do as a UN Habitat. My own experience is that when the Penang was affected by the tsunami, and people will move from one place to another place, and this place was on private land. And there's a really a tension between the owner of the land and also the people being just moved in for the sake of getting a safe place to stay. As a mayor at that time, I would like to share with you we have to have the political will to solve this problem. We have to also must have a data, and also must have a guidelines and also in terms of mechanism how we can solve this problem. My own example, which is to me I can consider is successful, is that what we did was that the land belong to the private sector, and we don't want to displace this person or the IDP to another place. We want them to settle in the same place. What is the win-win situation, a win-win formula what we did was that there are one piece of land that we discussed. Of course, engagement is very important. The engagement with the IDPs, engagement with the people, the owner, the land owner, also engagement with the community, the society around that areas. Because when the IDPs coming in, people were looking that this is something that is a different, to them, like different set of people coming in and encroach into their work, encroach into their living space, and encroach into their cultures. And what we did was that we discussed with the IDPs, we discussed also with the landowner. We came up with a formula. We would like, at that time I was a manager, I would like them to settle there. What we did was that we call it cross-subsidy. You know, we want the developer to cross-subsidize the number of people in the IDPs settle on the particular land. And of course, we have to, as I said, that they are settling on the ground, but we have to change their mindset. Rather than staying horizontally, now they have to stay vertically, because they cannot be staying on the people's land as a squatters. And we came up with a formula to give the private sector. Of course, private sector, they would like to earn some profit. We give a higher density, higher plot ratio for the other piece of land. I mean one piece of land, we designated this is for the IDP. The other portion of land, we give them high density, high plot ratio for them to do their construction, their development, and the profit. From there, they must have a social obligation to build the house for the IDP, so that the IDP can still stay in the same place. So like cross-subsidy. And this house, when they build, they give it to the city. And the city council will monitor and also will handle the giving to the IDPs. And we have many ways of looking at it, but I think that is, if I mention to you, if I tell you the stories here, will be very long. But the way is that public-private partnership is one way, I think, to settle these IDPs. But they must give the mechanism and the formula that they have win-win situation. And also to get the way that the IDPs agreed to live vertical on a multi-story, because we have to make them understand that rather than staying on the land that is not yours, and now you have a better house, better utilities, better road, and also better facilities. And that, I think, one example, I think, is the best practices that we can share with other areas or other places. That is one. Another one is on the UN Habitat. We are doing normative and also operational. Normative is that coming out with the guideline, coming out with the building block, coming out with the policy to help the cities and also the countries which are faced with these IDPs. For example, like building back better, I saw it, I'm very happy to see that you are putting that under reconstruction, and the climate resilient guidelines. And also climate resilient policy. That is one. And second one is also on the operational part. As I mentioned to you just now, we had in Mozambique, and also we have the experience supporting cities dealing with urban displacement in Somalia, in Iraq, in Sudan, Afghanistan, Lebanon, and what we are putting in all this experience together, and we come with best practices. And the thing that when we talk about the normative and operational, we have to look into the software and hardware. Software meaning that is how to deal with a disaster, the capacity building, the awareness about the disaster, the awareness about the what is going to happen, as what Bangladesh, I think, is doing. And the hardware is the actual infrastructure. How resilient the actual infrastructure. And the second is the policy and the implementation. And UN Habitat has come up with a strategic plan for 2020 to 2025, we put the effective urban crisis prevention and response as one of our 4 pillars. We have 4 pillars. One is to reduce inequality and poverty in the communities across urban-rural continuum, regardless their status. Second is how we can enhance this prosperity between cities and regions. Sometimes one city is wealthy, they can also cause the other city to become poor. Third is how we can strengthen the climate action and improve urban environment. And the fourth is, I mentioned just now, is urban crisis, where we're trying to look into improve the living standard and inclusion of migrants, refugees, and internally displaced persons. This is one of our concentration and one of our priorities in 2020 to 2025. And also enhance resilience of building environment and infrastructure, as I mentioned earlier. This we would like to see how sustainable urbanization is the key for development, for peace, and improved living conditions for all. And we have the experience in Turkana, in Kenya, where we, UN Habitat, working together with the host county, the county of Turkana, giving them the refugee, the land, and the UNHCR is also giving them the tent, but they have been there for 15 years. They are not going to move. And what we did was that we came in to give the overall planning of the area. Where is the school? Where is the community hall, the water supply, the sanitation, so that we can have the integration between the refugee and the host country, and also the people around there. I think these are a few things, a few examples that UN Habitat is doing, and we are here ready to get any feedback and any collaboration and partnership that you would like, and also maybe partner with Mr. Murakami and also Mr. Salam in Bangladesh, where we already have a lot of program in Bangladesh. Thank you very much, Mr. Bilal.
Thank you so much. I realize I've not been very good at keeping the time, and I would like to leave some space for the audience to ask a few questions. So can I just ask you, Kiyoshi, if you were to give a very concise advice to municipalities across the world on how to deal with the effects of disasters and other forms of crises in cities in the future, based on your experience? I know you've done a lot of, you really represent almost a model example of how things should be done, but of course there are always shortcomings in that response. So what would be your best advice in a couple of minutes?
I understand I tend to spend too much time talking, so try to brief it, make it brief. Yes, I think there's two things, actually. One is that, as Madam Chef mentioned, there's private and also, collaborations. This is more like, in the case of Briggs and Tagara, when we actually had evacuate a number of people, we didn't have that any particular, specific designated area, so that they really need to stay somewhere, right? So that's what happened is that within community, in the little bit of the hillside of communities, they actually had a number of the big houses. So that what happened is that the number of people actually, they knew each other, so that they actually absorbed those people into the house, and then also they actually provided the rice balls, like norimaki or those things. So we put together rice balls to serve the food to all those people refused by the tsunami. So those type of the collaboration within the community, so strong tie with the community is very, very important, so that at the case of the emergency, at the case of the disaster like this, they should be able to collaborate to support each other. That's one thing. The second thing is that also in case of prevention, also the community they themselves actually developed their own organizations. In the case of Riku Sentaga, there is one particular place called the Osabe district. They actually created a group of people who were age of 65 and above. So that's they basically do not have a work. So they actually have a free time in the most of the time. So that what they do is that men and women, they get together. They actually created the sections of the tasks. Whenever things happens, they would get together. So for instance, one section is that the promotion of the disasters or the promotion of emergency, operations. Second section is that the ladies, actually they get together to prepare the food. Third section is the group of the people who actually take care of the people who injured, for instance. So, and then the fourth one is that the people who know where is the one person who are staying in a home or disabled people or people with staying at home in a bed. So that they know each other, so that who actually take care of in the case of the emergency to take to a higher level or take to the safe place. Those type of the exercise actually is called very small community based self-preventive the system actually we created. So that is very, very important for us as well.
Thank you. Okay. Thanks very much. And Salimul, if I could ask you the same question, just to make it as efficient as possible. You've heard a lot. You're working, as I said, more on the prevention side. I know you haven't. This is you're still in the early stages of this very long-term initiative. But are you already learning lessons? Are you already stumbling across obstacles that you're learning how to overcome?
Thank you very much. So yes, let me phrase it in the way that I have come to the issue. I work on climate change. As I said, I'm not a migration expert or even an urbanization expert. But when it comes to the potential impacts of climate change globally, all over the world, anything that we are seeing today in terms of climatic events and weather-related events are going to get a lot worse. All right? And so anything we've prepared for in the past is inadequate. We're going to have to be much better prepared in the future. And it's in that context that my country, Bangladesh, being one of the most vulnerable countries to the impacts of climate change, which we've known for some time now, is now moving away from simply figuring out how big the problem is going to be, it's going to be big, to what are we going to do about it? And we are tackling this across a wide variety of issues, one of them being this issue of internally displaced climate migrants of the future. They're going to be there. They're going to be in big numbers. If we're not ready for them, it's going to be a crisis. So how are we going to prepare ourselves to avoid this crisis? And right now we're figuring out things to do. And I'd say in terms of lessons, the first lesson is getting people on board. It's everybody recognizing there's a problem, recognizing we need to do something about it, and then agreeing on some things that we can do about it. Not everything, but a few things. We're getting there. And the second one then is for the high-level decision makers within the country and then at a global level as well to invest in those solutions. And I must say the government of Bangladesh, the Prime Minister of Bangladesh is extremely well versed on this issue, very much a champion of building resilience to climate change. That's the sort of the ethos of the country now is from vulnerability to resilience. It's sort of a mindset change. We're no longer talking about the problem. We're talking about solutions to the problem. And then, thirdly and finally, empowering everybody to do something. So it's not somebody else's responsibility, as we just heard from Mr. Murakami. Elderly people have a role. Children have a role. Everybody has a role. Everybody needs to know what their role is, and they need to figure out what they can do. They need to practice. They need to capacitate themselves so that whenever something happens, and we can't stop it happening, it's going to happen, we are better prepared. and we can deal with it. And the human aspect of preparation is by far the most important aspect, as opposed to building infrastructure and protection. I'm not saying those aren't needed, but I'm saying if you have people that are better prepared, that's half the battle. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to open the floor to the audience. I can see one hand has shot up already. Please, and then Ambassador.
Thank you. George Papadatos, a permanent observer and head of mission of the European Public Law Organization. Let me thank you for organizing this event, and through you, the participants, the panelists, for their excellent presentation. I would like to bring up a topic that has not been covered, and in the form of a question. What percentage of displacement can be attributed to governmental failures? To what extent are governments responsible? I know it's a sensitive issue. There's no need to come up with names, but I think we should know something about it. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's collect a couple of questions. Ambassador.
Yes. Well, thank you for, thanks to all the presentations and the presentators for the interesting presentations. It's not a question from my side, but regarding the aftermath of the tsunami and the earthquake in Japan, the government of Japan and the regional governments, we try to listen to those who are affected, and we try to help them rebuild their lives and the wishes of the people. If they want to go back to their homes, we try to rebuild the land where they were living and trying to support their livelihoods. But I think there continues to be very difficult problem which was not raised, which is that even though the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant is under control and the radiation levels are low so that most of the people can return, there is still and the government monitors the radioactivity levels of the agriculture and the fishery products so that they are consumed within Japan and in other countries. But there continues to be a strong perception that the radioactivity levels are not safe. People are not visiting from other countries to Tohoku area. And this is a serious situation for the Tohoku area, which was already in economic decline even before the earthquake. And for people who want to stay in their own homes and to continue livelihoods. So we are trying to, I guess, promote facts about relating to the radioactivity levels. But I think this is an issue that, that not only, something that we cannot do by ourselves, but I think it requires, understanding the situation of the people who struggle because they are unfairly being sort of looked at as producing radioactive, dangerous products. But I just wanted to mention this. Thank you.
Thanks, and thanks for highlighting that specific issue, Ambassador Okani, where we've discussed it as well. It's true that the situation in Japan is made even more complex when you mix, it was a triple disaster, let's not forget. And that is one of the key barriers to durable solutions, as you say, the perception that the return areas may not be safe, and how do you change that perception over time? Monsieur l'Ambassadeur.
Merci de me donner la parole, et je voudrais remercier également les intervenants pour le partage d'expériences qu'ils ont bien voulu nous soumettre. Donc, je ne sais pas si je vous laisse est-ce que je vous laisse un temps pour pouvoir traduire? une expérience un peu singulière des déplacés internes dans une région du monde qui est le Sahel, qui combine deux types de handicaps. Parce que nous avons des déplacés climatiques, mais nous avons également des déplacés qui sont dus à des causes et des phénomènes de violence. Donc face à ces situations, il y a une forme de résilience qui repose sur les solidarités traditionnelles que sont les solidarités communautaires ou les solidarités familiales. Mais ces formes de résilience ou de solution ont quand même leurs limites parce que devant le flot continu de déplacés internes vers les zones urbaines, cela pose également des difficultés de cohabitation avec les populations urbaines qui ne sont pas préparées à recevoir des flots de déplacés aussi importants. Donc, il y a quelques années, avant que la violence ne se généralise dans cette partie de l'Afrique, nos pays avaient une situation stable, avaient commencé à développer des programmes de logements sociaux pour des populations qui avaient des revenus faibles. Or, nous avons affaire à des populations qui n'ont pas du tout de revenus, qui sont en incapacité, en raison des faiblesses structurelles de nos pays, de pouvoir trouver des sources de revenus dans des délais raisonnables. Donc je voudrais peut-être attirer l'attention des intervenants ici sur les formes de solidarité qu'on pourrait peut-être développer avec les agences des Nations Unies, avec les pays qui se sentent concernés par la sécurité internationale commune, par également les problèmes de changement climatique. Les agences des Nations Unies concentrent beaucoup d'aide et d'efforts sur les réfugiés, sur les migrants, et peut-être ont besoin maintenant d'avoir une approche, disons, plus pragmatique et plus opérationnelle concernant les déplacés internes qui cumulent ces deux handicaps, ces déplacés internes en raison des phénomènes climatiques et en raison des causes de violence et notamment liées au terrorisme. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Ambassadeur. I will translate very briefly. I'm sorry that we didn't have simultaneous translation from French. Ambassador Traoré from Mali, highlighting the impact of both climate and violent factors converging in the Sahel region of Africa, and emphasizing the difficulty in that region where we're looking at very low-income countries, very vulnerable populations who don't have oftentimes the resources and the resilience to cope with these hazards. And he is emphasizing the importance of local solidarity networks and would like to bring to the attention of the international community and of UN agencies in particular that is those local solutions and those local solidarity mechanisms that need to be supported and strengthened. J'espère que j'ai que j'ai été fidèle plus ou moins à votre intervention. Merci. Yes, Samuel from the Ethiopian mission, please.
Thank you. First, let me congratulate you on the launch of the report, which is very valuable. I think it's very important for designing interventions, and not only that, as indicated in the summary, it makes IDPs visible. So we very much appreciate the effort of IDMC on data collection and analysis. I just wanted to say a few things. My country has been impacted by especially slow onset disasters, by climate change. Over the past 5-6 years, probably around 8 million people were food insecure because of crop failures and on occasions floodings. So I think we need to also give attention to slow onset disasters. And I think we also need to take into consideration that there is a strong linkage between the climate change driver and the conflict drivers of displacement, because if we see the underlying reasons are very much related, that is land degradation, competition for resources indicated, in the report. So working through all these interventions is very important. Reading through these important issues is very critical. I just want to take this opportunity to highlight a few points with regard to the IDP situation in Ethiopia. As indicated in the report, we have seen a spike in number of IDPs in Ethiopia. In 2012, it was 200,000. We have now reached 2.8 million. And the government is responding on addressing these issues through a coordinated mechanism which takes into consideration durable solutions, peace building, restorative justice, and restoring livelihood. And the approach we have taken is the one which is endorsed during the World Humanitarian Summit in 2015. I just want to also flag that we have launched a strategy recently, which was 700 million, which I want to take this opportunity to appeal to donors to support this strategy, which aims at addressing both at provincial level, also on responding to current situations by through durable solutions, either by reintegration or relocation of IDPs. And also, probably I want to raise also, we are working in adopting the Kampala Convention, which is the most advanced instrument of the Africa region. The final consultation at the national level was held last month. So we're advancing both in terms of increasing our capacity at the institutional level and also on legal and policy frameworks. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Samuel. And we have highlighted the very positive steps that have been taken by the government of Ethiopia in responding to the current crisis. And thanks for reminding us all of that. We have 5 minutes left, and before I wrap up, I'm happy to take one or two more questions. There's one here.
I have a question for Dr. Huck. So, Nature Climate Change 2018, an article titled The Price of Fast Fashion. Seeing that in Bangladesh, approximately 80% of the exports, 20% of your GDP is associated to fast fashion, or otherwise known as ready-made garments. Which is caused from reduced minimum wages, attracting international engagement. My question is, what influence would increasing the minimum wage have on slum formation, economic displacement, and climate change in Bangladesh? Thank you.
Let's take one more question, and then I'll let Salimul answer that one in particular. Atle, good to see you. Always at the back, but
thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
As I always do, I want to congratulate IDMC for another very good report. I think it's very important that we have this annual report, we have the baseline from last year, and we are tracking progress and challenges. So congratulations to you and your colleagues. I also would like to thank IDMC for the work we have been doing to try to do a stock take of those challenges we have when it comes to disaster displacement. And I should maybe mention that my name is Atle Solberg. I work for the Platform on Disaster Displacement. So I also want to congratulate IDMC for the work we have tried to do to map off some of the challenges and finding the solutions. We're also very excited that we are entering into a project together with IDMC, where we will work together in the Pacific to combine data work, policy work, and capacity building. So we're looking very much forward to that. I do have a question, though, that we do know that there are 17.2 million displaced in the context of sudden onset events last year, so we will now all update our song sheets, our talking points, and refer to that number. But we are still struggling around the slow onset events and processes. And today we heard a lot about climate change. And I just wonder, can you indicate to us, Alexandra, how can we deal with those data challenges which I've heard from the excellent panel will only grow, and how can we be able to track and monitor the number of people that will be compelled to move in the future and actually are compelled to move? Thank you.
Thank you very much for those questions. Let me deal with the Bangladesh specific one first, and then I'll address one or two of the others. In the case of Bangladesh, you quite rightly pointed out, we have one of our major economic activities are thousands of ready-made garment manufacturing, which employs millions of women in particular, and is a major export of the country. You're quite right to point out the potential for providing better wages for the workers. It certainly would make a big difference. But I would also point out that in the case of Bangladesh, we are aware of the issues around this. And in fact, at the moment, 8 out of the topmost 15 green credentialed certified factories in the world are in Bangladesh. These are private companies who have invested in certifying their factories as being compliant with global standards, and they don't get an extra price for this. You know, the consumers aren't willing to pay them 1 cent extra for doing that, but they've done it anyway because it's the right thing to do. And we're trying to encourage that kind of, as I said, people realizing what's the right thing to do and doing it for the right reasons rather than being compelled to do it. If I can also address the issue of numbers that was just raised. I gave you a ballpark figure for Bangladesh. We're talking 10 million people over the next decade. It's not an exact figure, it's a ballpark figure. If we don't intervene, they will become forced migrants coming to Dhaka. If we do intervene, they'll go somewhere else and we won't count them. Right? They will not be forced migrants coming to Dhaka, and that's what we want. We want that number to not end up being forced migrants coming to Dhaka. If I can also address the issue of slow onset, which my Ethiopian colleague raised very well. The new aspect of climate change is really slow onset. What it does to the rapid onset floods and cyclones makes them more intense and perhaps more frequent. On the slow onset, that's brand new. The longer term droughts that we are seeing, we never saw these before. Sea level rise that we are seeing, we never saw these before. And Ethiopia and Bangladesh are good examples, one in the case of drought, the other one in the case of sea level rise, where we now have to figure this thing out. It's not business as usual anymore. It's a business as unusual. The future is going to be very, very different, and we have to think of ways to deal with that. And we're trying. We don't have the solutions yet. I just mentioned one of them. And if I can finally address the question of whether it's the government's fault. So speaking as a climate change scientist, we've been saying this thing for 30 years now, and governments haven't done a thing. They are responsible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. I will just also compliment Salim's response to Atle on the slow onset. As you know, Atle, IDMC has already started investing several years ago in trying to paint a more comprehensive picture of displacement in the context of disasters, including slow onset disasters. And actually this year, our global report and our disaster figures do include displacement by drought in several countries. And that is very much the result of very strong partnerships and investments with our data providers on the ground. IOM has started tracking people displaced in the context of drought in several countries in sub-Saharan Africa. IDMC has already conceptualized what drought displacement looks like and how it's different from other forms of migration in the Horn of Africa. But of course, as Salim says, it's a very complex phenomenon that requires monitoring and tracking over long periods of time, and that of course costs money, it takes resources, and it takes political will in many contexts as well. So this is also, it's always IDMC's same call every year for more support and for more investment in the monitoring before we can start putting numbers to this phenomenon. I would like to sum up what has been discussed today, and I would like to thank our panelists for having been with us and for having shared their experiences. There have been a lot of commonalities actually in what you've said. There were 4 things I think that have come up from this last discussion. The first one is the importance of investment from the global to the local level. We've seen just how much it costs to actually respond in an appropriate way to a disaster when it strikes. You talked about, just for one city, it's a 3.5 billion reconstruction plan that was put in place in Rikuzentakata. That's huge, right? And that's just on the response side. Salim talks about the type of investment that's needed to prevent and to prepare for the future. That's also not just costly financially, but it's costly in terms of political will, in terms of changing mentalities, changing the narrative around it, changing the way we even frame the issue and talk about it. So I think that investment, and Ms. Sharif, you embody the international, the global level response to this phenomenon, but you said it very clearly yourself. We need to implement now. We're at the implementation phase, and everything that is written up in your strategic plan and in the Sustainable Development Goals will only be meaningful if they are concretized and supported with the right kinds of resources all the way down to the local level. So the issue of investment is number one. The second one, which is very much related, I think we've already looked at it, is that it does require longer time frames, collaboration, as you said, integrated approaches, collaboration across mandates, across budgets, across disciplines, so that we can not just respond, but also start preventing as well. The third element, which has come out very clearly, it came out in my presentation, but very clearly from yours, is that the responses and the approaches have to be people-centered. The inclusion of displaced communities in decision-making processes is key. But the inclusion of those communities, even in the response, the solidarity that Ambassador Traoré is mentioning as well, that solidarity is so important, and without that, we won't see the results that we want to see. So it means inclusive planning, it means getting people on board, as Salimul says, it means changing mindsets, and it means ultimately leaving no one behind, making sure that those people with those specific vulnerabilities, those women that I showed you earlier, whose stories I told you about, those women, those children, people with specific disabilities who I understand, Mr. Murakami, were disproportionately affected during the tsunami disaster, that all these people with specific vulnerabilities are included in the response process and are not left behind. And then the fourth element, and you will all smile because I'm IDMC, so I will of course always end on the issue of data and information. You did talk a lot about information sharing and the importance of building bridges between different communities who are impacted by the same kinds of problems. I love your story, Mr. Murakami, about that piece, the piece of the high school that drifted off into the Pacific Ocean and 2.5 years later ended up on the shores of California and got picked up by high school kids in California. That city with whom you've now developed a partnership, you're learning, you're sharing experiences. Now that is exactly what we need to see across the world. So information sharing, sharing of best practices, learning what works and what doesn't work. That actually has to go through a documentation process. We need to be able to document what is actually happening. We need to document what the baseline is today and measure the progress that we're collectively making as we go along. So I will end on IDMC and IDMC's role in all of this. Of course, we are committed at LE to refining the global picture, understanding it better, providing better quality data, strengthening the capacities of our data providers and all our partners on the ground. We are committed to delivering the sound policy analysis that has to go with the better data, and we are committed to working with all of you in our joint efforts to prevent and to reduce internal displacement by both conflict and disasters in the future. So I'd like to thank you all very much for coming today. I appreciate the fact that this room was full from the beginning, testimony to our collective interest and passion for this topic. I would like to thank you all so much for having come such a long way, all the way from Japan and Bangladesh and Nairobi to be with us today. And thank you to all of you. And please don't hesitate to contact us for more information if you need it. And please don't hesitate to join us for the cocktail reception that is happening in the next few minutes on the rooftop of the Palais des Nations. Can someone tell me the name of the bar? Restaurant des Délégués on the, sorry? 8th floor. But we will be ushering you towards that place as we leave this room. Thank you so much.